Carl Jung's final message about empaths will shatter everything you believe about your compassion. The empath, Jung discovered, is just the child who was never allowed to be selfish. That overwhelming need to fix everyone, to absorb their pain, to disappear yourself for others, that's not spiritual gift. That's survival programming from a childhood where your needs were too much, your feelings too loud, your very existence conditional on serving others. But here's what makes Jung's insight revolutionary. He didn't see empaths as broken. He saw them as halfway through what he called individuation, the psychological journey toward wholeness. You already know this deep down. You've always sensed that your empathy came with a cost you couldn't name. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But you've always felt that who you truly are was never allowed to exist, that your authentic self was sacrificed to keep others comfortable. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why your sensitivity feels like both a gift and a burden. You'll recognize the psychological patterns that turned your natural empathy into a survival strategy. And most importantly, you'll discover Jung's path to what I call sacred selfishness, the healthy boundaries that transform empathy from compulsion into conscious choice. This isn't about becoming less caring. It's about reclaiming the right to care for yourself with the same intensity you've always cared for others. Jung understood something that most people miss about empathic development. What we call empathy in adults often begins as what I call emotional hypervigilance in childhood, a survival mechanism that develops when a child's safety depends on constantly monitoring the emotional states of their caregivers. Think about this pattern: the child who learns to read their parent's moods before the parent even speaks, the little one who becomes the family emotional barometer, always sensing storms before they hit, the kid who learns that their own needs create tension, but anticipating others' needs creates safety. Jung called this premature ego adaptation, when children develop sophisticated psychological skills, not from healthy development, but from necessity. Your nervous system became a seismograph for danger, attuned to every emotional tremor in your environment. This isn't conscious learning. This is adaptive wiring. Your brain literally rewired itself for survival in an emotionally unpredictable environment. You developed what Jung termed psychological antennae, an extraordinary ability to sense what others feel and need. But here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. This survival adaptation came with a terrible cost: the suppression of what he called your authentic selfishness, the healthy narcissism that every child needs to develop a strong sense of self. Jung wrote, "The healthy individual is able to love himself as much as he loves others." But the future empath learned the opposite lesson. Love others more than yourself, because your needs are dangerous. If you learned to read the room before you could read books, comment below, "I was the family emotional detective." This creates what I call the empathic paradox. The very sensitivity that makes you so attuned to others becomes the barrier that prevents you from knowing yourself. You became an expert in everyone else's inner world while remaining a stranger to your own. Jung understood that this pattern, while adaptive in childhood, becomes self-destructive in adulthood. The child who wasn't allowed to be selfish grows into the adult who can't advocate for themselves, set boundaries, or even identify their own needs. Jung made a startling discovery about what lies hidden in the unconscious of people with empathic patterns. In the shadow, the rejected parts of the psyche, he found not darkness, but what I call forbidden selfishness, the natural self-advocacy that was deemed unacceptable in childhood. Most empaths carry tremendous guilt about their shadow because it contains everything they were taught was wrong: anger, boundaries, saying no, putting themselves first, having needs, demanding respect. Jung called this shadow formation through moral conditioning. But here's Jung's revolutionary insight. These selfish impulses aren't pathological. They're the missing pieces of a complete personality. The empath who never learned healthy selfishness becomes what Jung termed a wounded healer, someone who gives from emptiness rather than fullness. Jung observed that empaths often unconsciously resent their own compassion. They give and give, but underneath, there's rage, there's exhaustion, there's a part of them that wants to stop caring, to walk away, to choose themselves for once. This isn't because they're bad people. It's because Jung's compensation principle is at work. The psyche is trying to balance the one-sided development by pushing the rejected qualities into consciousness. Think about what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency for things to turn into their opposite when taken to extremes. The person who gives endlessly eventually becomes resentful. The one who never says no eventually explodes. The empath who refuses their shadow becomes bitter. Jung understood that integration of the shadow isn't about becoming selfish. It's about reclaiming the right to exist as a complete human being. The empath's shadow contains their sacred selfishness, the healthy ego strength that allows for authentic relationships. If you've ever felt guilty for wanting to put yourself first, comment, "My needs feel selfish, but they're not wrong." Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, the darkness isn't cruelty or narcissism. It's the simple, radical act of believing they matter as much as everyone else. Jung identified a specific crisis that empaths face in their psychological development. He called it the individuation imperative, the moment when the psyche demands that you become who you actually are, not who you learned to be for survival. This crisis often manifests as what I call empathic burnout, not just tiredness, but a deep soul exhaustion that comes from living inauthentically for years. Jung understood this as the psyche's rebellion against continued self-abandonment. The symptoms Jung documented are unmistakable. You can't fake caring anymore. The old motivations don't work. People's problems feel heavy instead of meaningful. You start resenting the very thing that once defined you, your willingness to help others. Jung saw this not as failure, but as psychological emergence. Your authentic self is trying to be born, but it requires dismantling the false self that was built around serving others. This is where Jung's concept of the transcendent function becomes crucial. The transcendent function is the psyche's ability to bridge opposites. In this case, the caring self and the self-caring self. It's not about choosing between empathy and selfishness. It's about integrating both into what Jung called individuated wholeness. Jung observed that empaths in this crisis often feel like they're betraying everyone by changing. People say things like, "You're not the same person anymore," or "You've become selfish." Jung understood this as the collective's resistance to individual development. But here's what Jung discovered about this process. The people who truly love you will support your individuation. The ones who resist it were benefiting from your self-abandonment. Jung called this differentiation anxiety, the fear that healthy boundaries will end relationships. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But for empaths, this requires what I call developmental courage, the willingness to disappoint people who preferred you diminished. If you've been told you've changed since setting boundaries, comment, "I didn't change, I just stopped hiding." Jung understood that this individuation crisis is actually a spiritual emergency, the soul's demand for authenticity. The empath who heeds this call doesn't become less caring. They become consciously caring instead of compulsively caring. Jung introduced a concept that most people misunderstand: sacred selfishness. This isn't narcissistic self-absorption. It's what Jung called the ethical obligation to become yourself, the recognition that your first responsibility is to your own psychological development. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. who looks inside awakes. For empaths, looking inside often reveals years of self-neglect disguised as virtue. What I call conscious selfishness involves several key elements that Jung identified as necessary for psychological health. First, emotional sovereignty, the recognition that you're not responsible for managing other people's feelings. Jung understood that taking responsibility for others' emotions actually prevents their psychological growth. Second, boundary consciousness, the ability to sense where you end and others begin. Jung called this ego boundary development, and he saw it as essential for both individual health and authentic relationship. Third, need legitimacy, accepting that your needs are as valid as anyone else's. Jung observed that empaths often treat their own needs as optional, while treating others' needs as mandatory. Jung discovered that empaths who develop sacred selfishness actually become more helpful, not less. They give from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than weakness. This creates what Jung called differentiated love, the capacity to care for others without losing yourself in the process. You can feel compassion without absorbing pain. You can offer support without taking responsibility. You can love without disappearing. Jung understood that the highest form of service comes from individuals who have done their own psychological work. The person who has reclaimed their sacred selfishness offers the world their authentic presence rather than their people-pleasing performance. If you've learned that taking care of yourself makes you a better helper to others, comment, "I give from overflow, not emptiness." Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For empaths, this includes accepting the parts of themselves that want recognition, rest, reciprocity, and respect, all the things they were taught were selfish to want. Jung made a profound observation about what happens to empaths' relationships when they begin practicing sacred selfishness. He called it relational recalibration, the process where relationships either deepen through mutual authenticity or end because they were based on the empath's self-abandonment. The empaths who begin setting boundaries often discover something shocking. Many of their relationships were built on what Jung called projective identification. People weren't relating to them as individuals. They were relating to them as functions, the caretaker, the listener, the problem solver. Jung observed that when empaths stop playing these functional roles, some people experience what I call supply withdrawal. They become angry, manipulative, or accusatory because their emotional needs are no longer being automatically met. But Jung also documented something beautiful. The relationships that survive this transformation become what he called authentic encounters. Instead of one person giving and one receiving, both individuals meet as equals, each responsible for their own emotional well-being. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But true meeting can only happen between individuated people, those who know where they end and others begin. This is why Jung emphasized that empaths must learn what I call relational selectivity. Not everyone deserves access to your empathy. Not every person who asks for help is ready to receive it. Not every relationship that feels familiar is healthy. Jung understood that empaths often confuse intensity with intimacy, need with love, and drama with depth. Learning to recognize the difference requires developing what Jung called psychological discernment, the ability to see people as they are rather than as you wish they were. The individuated empath attracts different people than the self-abandoning empath. They draw those who are also doing their own psychological work, rather than those looking for someone to do it for them. Jung observed that this shift can feel lonely at first, because the empath is breaking generational patterns of codependency. But it ultimately leads to what he called authentic belonging, relationships based on mutual respect rather than mutual need. If you've noticed that setting boundaries changed who wants to be around you, comment, "I attracted my equals when I stopped accepting less." Jung's wisdom here is clear. You cannot have authentic relationships until you become an authentic person. And becoming authentic requires embracing your sacred selfishness. Jung's vision of psychological wholeness includes what I call the integrated empath, someone who has reclaimed their sensitivity as a conscious choice rather than an unconscious compulsion. This person represents Jung's ideal of individuation achieved. The integrated empath possesses what Jung called conscious empathy, the ability to feel with others without losing themselves in the process. They've learned to use their sensitivity as a tool rather than being used by it. Jung identified several characteristics of psychological integration that apply specifically to empaths. First, emotional choice, the capacity to decide when and how much to feel with others. Jung understood that healthy empathy has an on-off switch controlled by conscious will rather than automatic response. Second, compassionate detachment, the ability to care without carrying. Jung observed that the most helpful people maintain what he called loving distance, close enough to help, far enough away to maintain perspective. Third, reciprocal relationships, connections where empathy flows both ways. Jung noted that integrated empaths naturally attract people who can also give, creating what he called mutual individuation. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The integrated empath has achieved this by learning that their truest self includes both their capacity for compassion and their right to self-preservation. This integration creates what Jung called earned security, a deep inner stability that doesn't depend on others' approval or emotional state. The integrated empath can witness others' pain without absorbing it, offer support without taking responsibility, and love without losing themselves. Jung understood that this level of integration serves the collective good. Integrated empaths model healthy boundaries, authentic relationships, and conscious compassion. They show others that it's possible to be sensitive without being self-destructive. The journey from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy is what Jung called the hero's journey of the psyche. It requires facing the shadow, integrating the opposites, and choosing wholeness over approval. If you've learned to help others without hurting yourself, comment, "I'm a conscious empath now." Jung's final insight about empaths is this: your sensitivity is indeed a gift, but only when it's offered from a place of choice rather than compulsion, strength rather than weakness, wholeness rather than woundedness. Jung's most profound discovery about empaths centers on what I call the freedom realization, the moment when you understand that your empathy was never about other people. It was about you trying to feel safe in an unpredictable world. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The empath's journey reveals that their hyper-responsibility for others was actually an attempt to control their environment, to prevent the emotional chaos they experienced in childhood. This realization can be both liberating and terrifying. It means recognizing that much of what you called love was actually psychological management, unconscious strategies to keep people calm, happy, and stable so you could feel secure. But Jung discovered something liberating about this realization. Once you understand that your empathy was a survival strategy, you can choose to keep it or transform it. You're no longer controlled by unconscious programming. You become what Jung called the author of your own psychological story. This freedom creates what I call authentic empathy, sensitivity that comes from love rather than fear, choice rather than compulsion, strength rather than vulnerability. The integrated empath feels with others because they want to, not because they have to. Jung observed that this transformation often triggers what he called existential guilt, the feeling that you're betraying your essential nature by changing. The voice in your head that says, "But I've always been the helper," or "People depend on me," or "What if no one loves me if I'm not useful?" But Jung understood this guilt as the final resistance of the false self that was built around serving others. He called it identity grief, mourning the version of yourself that was never real but felt familiar. Jung also identified what he called the freedom paradox, the discovery that having the choice to help makes helping more meaningful, not less. When empathy becomes voluntary rather than compulsive, it transforms from burden to gift. The truth Jung revealed is this: you were never meant to be an emotional caretaker for the world. You were meant to be a conscious individual who chooses when and how to offer your gifts. Your empathy was supposed to be a superpower, not a burden. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." For empaths, this includes accepting that they have the right to exist without constantly proving their worth through service to others. This acceptance creates what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the recognition that you are the ultimate authority on your own experience. No one else can tell you what you should feel, what you should give, or who you should be. Jung observed that empaths who achieve this sovereignty often go through what he called the reparenting phase, learning to give themselves the unconditional acceptance they never received as children. They learn to speak to themselves with kindness, to prioritize their own needs, and to celebrate their own achievements. This internal reparenting is crucial because Jung understood that you cannot give from emptiness indefinitely. The empath who learns to nurture themselves becomes capable of authentic nurturing of others. Jung also noted that psychological sovereignty often involves grieving the unlived life, mourning all the dreams, goals, and experiences you sacrificed to keep others comfortable. You might realize you chose careers, relationships, and life paths based on what others needed rather than what you wanted. But Jung saw this grief as necessary and healing. It's the psyche's way of honoring what was lost while making space for what wants to emerge. The empath who achieves this sovereignty discovers something remarkable. Their capacity for genuine compassion actually increases. When you're no longer bleeding yourself dry for others, you have more to give from a place of abundance. Jung observed that free empaths become conscious healers, people who help others from wholeness rather than woundedness. They no longer need to fix people to feel valuable. They no longer need to be needed. This creates what Jung called liberated love, affection that doesn't come with strings attached, help that doesn't create dependency, presence that doesn't require reciprocity. Jung's final message about empaths is clear. Your journey is not about becoming less sensitive. It's about becoming consciously sensitive. It's about reclaiming your empathy as a gift you choose to give rather than a debt you're compelled to pay. But Jung also warned about what he called the integration temptation, the urge to go back to old patterns when faced with others' discomfort with your new boundaries. He understood that growth requires staying committed to your truth even when others pressure you to return to your former self. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For empaths, this means recognizing that who you truly are includes both your capacity for compassion and your right to exist fully, completely, without apology. If you've realized your empathy is a choice, not an obligation, comment, "I choose when to care," and that makes it more powerful. Jung understood that the integrated empath becomes a beacon for others, not through self-sacrifice, but through self-realization. You show the world what it looks like to be both sensitive and strong, caring and boundaried, empathic and whole. The freedom to choose when and how to care is the ultimate gift Jung offered to empaths. It transforms sensitivity from a weakness that others exploit into a strength that you consciously deploy. The empath is just the child who was never allowed to be selfish, but now you understand what Jung really meant. Your empathy isn't your flaw, it's your unfinished development. You learn to use your sensitivity as a survival tool instead of developing it as conscious choice. Jung showed us that the path forward isn't about becoming less empathic. It's about becoming consciously empathic. It's about reclaiming what he called your sacred selfishness, the healthy ego strength that allows for authentic relationships and genuine service. You don't have to choose between caring for others and caring for yourself. Jung's individuation process shows you how to integrate both into psychological wholeness. The child who was never allowed to be selfish can grow into the adult who chooses when and how to give their gifts. Your sensitivity is indeed a superpower, but only when it comes from strength rather than survival, choice rather than compulsion, wholeness rather than woundedness. Jung spent his life proving that the most empathic people are those who have learned to empathize with themselves first. The next time someone tells you that you're too sensitive or that you've become selfish, remember Jung's wisdom. You're not too much for this world. You're just finally becoming enough for yourself. And that transformation, from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy, is exactly what the world needs. Not more people who give until they break, but more people who know their worth and give from overflow. If you want to explore more of Jung's insights about psychological transformation, check out my video, Why You Lost Interest in Your Hobbies, After Awakening, where we dive into how consciousness development changes your relationship with activities and interests. The empath who was never allowed to be selfish is finally free to choose. And that choice, to love yourself as much as you love others, is the most generous gift you can give to a world that desperately needs whole, conscious, integrated people. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension. Are unmistakable. You can't fake caring anymore. The old motivations don't work. People's problems feel heavy instead of meaningful. You start resenting the very thing that once defined you, your willingness to help others. Jung saw this not as failure, but as psychological emergence. Your authentic self is trying to be born, but it requires dismantling the false self that was built around serving others. This is where Jung's concept of the transcendent function becomes crucial. The transcendent function is the psyche's ability to bridge opposites. In this case, the caring self and the self-caring self. It's not about choosing between empathy and selfishness. It's about integrating both into what Jung called individuated wholeness. Jung observed that empaths in this crisis often feel like they're betraying everyone by changing. People say things like, "You're not the same person anymore," or "You've become selfish." Jung understood this as the collective's resistance to individual development. But here's what Jung discovered about this process. The people who truly love you will support your individuation. The ones who resist it were benefiting from your self-abandonment. Jung called this differentiation anxiety, the fear that healthy boundaries will end relationships. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But for empaths, this requires what I call developmental courage, the willingness to disappoint people who preferred you diminished. If you've been told you've changed since setting boundaries, comment, "I didn't change, I just stopped hiding." Jung understood that this individuation crisis is actually a spiritual emergency, the soul's demand for authenticity. The empath who heeds this call doesn't become less caring. They become consciously caring instead of compulsively caring. Jung introduced a concept that most people misunderstand: sacred selfishness. This isn't narcissistic self-absorption. It's what Jung called the ethical obligation to become yourself, the recognition that your first responsibility is to your own psychological development. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." For empaths, looking inside often reveals years of self-neglect disguised as virtue. What I call conscious selfishness involves several key elements that Jung identified as necessary for psychological health. First, emotional sovereignty, the recognition that you're not responsible for managing other people's feelings. Jung understood that taking responsibility for others' emotions actually prevents their psychological growth. Second, boundary consciousness, the ability to sense where you end and others begin. Jung called this ego boundary development, and he saw it as essential for both individual health and authentic relationship. Third, need legitimacy, accepting that your needs are as valid as anyone else's. Jung observed that empaths often treat their own needs as optional, while treating others' needs as mandatory. Jung discovered that empaths who develop sacred selfishness actually become more helpful, not less. They give from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than weakness. This creates what Jung called differentiated love, the capacity to care for others